Oh, you're gonna like this one. You ever walk into your house, drop your keys, kick off your shoes, thinking it's just another boring night? Yeah.
Wrong?
Because tonight, you didn't just walk home. You walked into a battlefield. And the funny part, you didn't even know you were the exorcist. You thought you were tired. You thought it was stress. You thought the heaviness in the air was just one of those days. But the walls, they were watching. The silence, it wasn't empty. And that cold shiver that ran down your spine when you turned off the lights, that wasn't fear. That was something realizing you arrived. See? Demons don't always crawl on ceilings. They don't always whisper in Latin. Sometimes they hide in doubt, in old memories, in the anger you never released, in the version of you that kept losing. And tonight, you walked in carrying something they didn't expect: clarity, confidence, a shift in energy so violent it cracked the atmosphere. You didn't chant. You didn't burn sage. You didn't call a priest. You just stood there, and suddenly the heaviness started choking. Because when a person decides, really decides, to rise, darkness panics. Oh, I love that part. You see, evil thrives on confusion. It feeds on hesitation. It decorates your ceiling with fear and calls it normal. But the moment you stepped through that door with self-awareness, you became the infestation to them. And that's the twist, isn't it? You thought you were coming home to rest, but you walked into your own haunted mind and accidentally cleansed it. No ritual, no holy water, just presence. And that terrifies the shadows more than any prayer ever could. So tonight, we're not talking about ghosts. We're talking about the demons that lived in your habits, in your excuses, in your silence, and how, without even realizing it, you just pulled off a spiritual assassination. Welcome home. The moment you touched that door handle, something shifted. Not outside, but inside you. You thought you were just coming home from another long day, carrying stress on your shoulders and noise in your head. But what you were really carrying was a frequency change. And frequencies, they don't knock politely. They disrupt. The air felt thicker because it was used to the older version of you. The tired one, the doubtful one, the one who walked in defeated. But tonight, there was something different in your posture, subtle. Dangerous. Awake. Energy is funny like that. It doesn't need an announcement. It doesn't need applause. It just enters and rearranges the room without asking permission. The silence didn't greet you the same way. The walls didn't echo the same thoughts back to you. Even your footsteps sounded heavier, not with exhaustion, but with authority. Because when your internal state changes, the atmosphere responds, always. You didn't light candles. You didn't whisper affirmations. You didn't declare war. But something in you refused to shrink, and darkness. Darkness survives on shrinking. It feeds on the version of you that apologizes for existing. It thrives when you drag yourself across the floor of your own life. But the second you stand upright, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, the entire energy grid trembles. That heaviness you used to feel when you entered your own space, it wasn't random. It was accumulated doubt. Old arguments replaying in the corners. Regrets breathing under the couch. Every time you told yourself you weren't enough, it left a residue. And spaces remember residue. But when you walked in with awareness, real awareness, it was like opening windows in a room that had been sealed for years. The shift wasn't loud. It didn't explode. It pressed. Slowly. Firmly. Like gravity reversing direction. The tension in your chest loosened because something no longer had permission to sit there. You didn't consciously command it to leave. You just stopped hosting it. And that is power. The kind that doesn't scream. The kind that destabilizes shadows without touching them. Energy doesn't argue. It overrides. The old emotional patterns tried to greet you like usual. That familiar wave of fatigue. That whisper of, "You're still behind." That quiet dread. But they didn't land the same way. They hit something solid. You didn't wrestle them. You didn't negotiate. You just observed them. And observation dissolves what once controlled you. You may not have noticed it immediately, but the room felt lighter because you were lighter. Not in weight, in resistance. The shift happened the second you stopped identifying with the chaos. The second you chose presence over panic. That single decision, almost invisible, created a crack in the structure of everything that fed on your confusion. You walked in carrying clarity, like a concealed weapon, calm like armor, self-respect like fire beneath the skin. And when energy like that crosses a threshold, it cleanses by default, not violently, not dramatically, just inevitably. They were never loud, were they? Not the kind with horns and red skin. No, the real ones were quieter. They slipped into your thoughts dressed like logic. They sounded reasonable, practical. Maybe you're not ready? Maybe this is just who you are. Maybe don't try. And you listened, not because you were weak, but because they spoke in your own voice. That's how they survive. They don't attack. They blend. Doubt doesn't kick the door down. It moves in slowly, like fog under a crack. One failed attempt. One embarrassing moment. One rejection. And suddenly it builds a throne in your mind. You start consulting it before making decisions. You start asking permission from the very thing that keeps you small. It tells you it's protecting you, keeping you safe. But safety, when overused, becomes a cage with velvet walls. And then there are habits. Beautiful little routines that feel harmless. The scrolling when you should be building. The silence when you should be speaking. The procrastination disguised as preparation. They feel comfortable. Familiar, predictable. But comfort can be the most sophisticated trap. Because you don't fight what feels normal. You defend it. These are the infestations that don't rattle chains at midnight. They sit with you at breakfast. They walk beside you to work. They tuck you into bed with the same old excuses. Tomorrow. Later. When the time is right. And every time you obey, they grow stronger. Not in size, but in authority. The dangerous part, you start confusing them for personality. That's just how I am. No. That's how you adapted. There's a difference. Personality is expression. Adaptation is armor. And armor, if worn too long, starts to fuse with the skin. You forget what it feels like to move freely without it. Doubt rewrites your history. It edits out your wins and magnifies your losses. It replays your worst moments in high definition while blurring your victories into the background. And habits. They automate your stagnation. They make sure you don't even have to consciously choose self-sabotage anymore. It runs on schedule. But here's the twist. They only operate in unconscious territory. The second you notice them, really notice them, they flinch. Awareness is light in a room full of things that survive in shadow. When you catch yourself mid-excuse, when you hear that whisper of, "You can't," and pause instead of agreeing, that's disruption. That's resistance. They were never supernatural. They were psychological, emotional, repetitive. They lived in patterns you never questioned, in thoughts you never challenged, in behaviors you labeled as normal. And the moment you started observing instead of obeying, they lost their camouflage. Because demons hidden in doubt and habit don't fear strength. They fear recognition. You were waiting for something dramatic, weren't you? A ritual, a sign, a lightning strike from the sky to announce your transformation. But awareness doesn't arrive with thunder. It slips in quietly, like a blade hidden in a smile. One moment you're reacting the way you always have. Defensive, doubtful, distracted. And the next moment you're watching yourself do it. That's the fracture. That's the beginning of the end for everything that used to control you. Awareness is cruel in the most beautiful way. It doesn't comfort your illusions. It exposes them. It forces you to see the pattern instead of just living inside it. You catch the thought before it spirals. You notice the tension before it turns into anger. You observe the urge to escape before it becomes another wasted hour. And in that split second of observation, something ancient inside you wakes up. Most people think power is force, volume, aggression. But awareness is precision. It doesn't need to shout. It simply shines light exactly where the shadow was hiding. And shadows don't argue with light. They dissolve, not because they're weak, but because they were never solid to begin with. For years, you may have fought your fears directly, tried to suppress them, tried to overpower them, but fighting gives them importance. Resistance feeds them. Awareness starves them. When you look at your insecurity without flinching, without identifying with it, it loses its script. It doesn't know how to perform without your participation. Think about it. A habit only works when you're unconscious. The second you become aware of reaching for distraction, aware of speaking negatively to yourself, aware of shrinking in a room, there's a pause. That pause is sacred. It's the crack in the possession. It's the moment the spell weakens. Because now you're choosing instead of reacting. Awareness separates you from the storm. You're no longer inside it. You're observing it. Thoughts still appear, emotions still rise. But they're not you. They're passing weather. And once you realize that, the entire haunted house collapses. The fear that once felt permanent reveals itself as temporary. The anger that felt justified reveals itself as conditioned. The doubt that felt true reveals itself as repetitive. This is why awareness feels uncomfortable at first. It strips away excuses. It removes the luxury of blaming circumstances. It makes you accountable for your own internal climate. But that discomfort, that's purification. That's the infestation realizing it has been seen. You don't need holy water when you have clarity. You don't need to burn incense when you can sit with your own thoughts without running. The ultimate exorcism isn't dramatic. It's disciplined observation. It's the willingness to witness yourself without judgment and without denial. And once you truly see something, you can never unsee it. Fear was never the monster under your bed. It was the voice that convinced you to stay in it. It doesn't scream. It negotiates. It tells you to wait, to stay quiet, to avoid the risk. It studies your insecurities like a scientist, then uses them as leverage. Don't speak up, you'll look foolish. Don't try, you'll fail again. Don't change, people won't like the new you. And every time you obey, it smiles. Not because it hates you, but because it survives through you. Fear feeds on silence. Not just the silence of your mouth, but the silence of your potential. The ideas you never share. The boundaries you never set. The truth you swallow to keep the peace. Every unspoken word becomes fuel. Every avoided confrontation becomes reinforcement. You think you're keeping things calm, but you're feeding the very thing that keeps you small. It thrives in the gap between what you feel and what you express. When you feel disrespected but laugh it off. When you feel inspired but call it unrealistic. When you feel capable but pretend you're not ready. That gap, that hesitation, is where fear builds its throne. It doesn't need chains. It just needs your compliance. And the strangest part, it disguises itself as wisdom. It tells you it's protecting you from embarrassment, from rejection, from pain. It reminds you of your worst memories like they're caution signs. Remember what happened last time? It whispers. And you do remember. So you shrink, you adjust. You dim yourself to avoid reliving the discomfort. But discomfort is not destruction. And fear knows that if you ever truly understood that, it would starve. Silence becomes its greatest weapon. The longer you stay quiet about your dreams, the easier they are to abandon. The longer you avoid the hard conversation, the more powerful the tension becomes. The longer you postpone action, the heavier it feels to start. Fear doesn't have to stop you directly. It just has to delay you long enough that you stop yourself. It amplifies imagined consequences while minimizing your strength. It paints failure as fatal and rejection as permanent. It convinces you that one mistake defines you, that one opinion can diminish you, that one setback erases your worth. And when you believe that narrative, you start living cautiously instead of fully. But the moment you speak, even with a trembling voice, something shifts. The moment you act despite the anxiety, despite the uncertainty, fear loses its steady supply. It weakens when exposed to movement. It shrinks when confronted with expression. Because fear cannot dominate a person who refuses to stay silent. There comes a moment when the darkness realizes it picked the wrong host. For so long, you thought you were fighting something outside of you. Bad luck, toxic people, heavy circumstances, invisible forces pressing against your chest at night. But the real battlefield was internal. The real shift happened the second you stopped trying to escape your darkness and started facing it. Not to destroy it blindly. Not to deny it, but to understand it. And that's when the roles reversed. Because darkness expects fear. It expects avoidance. It expects you to run from your anger, suppress your jealousy, numb your pain, bury your trauma. It survives when you refuse to look at it directly. But when you turn around and stare at it, when you trace it back to its root and say, I see you, something ancient and predatory inside you awakens. You stop being the hunted. You become the hunter. The insecurities that once chased you through every opportunity start trembling under your observation. The memories that used to trigger you lose their dramatic soundtrack. The habits that once controlled you begin to feel small, almost pathetic. Not because they disappeared overnight, but because you grew larger than them. There's a difference between suppressing darkness and mastering it. Suppression keeps it alive in secret. Mastery drags it into the open and dissects it. You begin to recognize that your anger was unprocessed pain. Your procrastination was fear of judgment. Your self-sabotage was protection against vulnerability. Once you understand the mechanism, it loses its mystique. It becomes data instead of destiny. And that's terrifying, not for you, but for the version of you that thrived on chaos. When you stop reacting impulsively, your triggers lose their grip. When you stop needing validation, manipulation fails. When you stop fearing solitude, loneliness has no leverage. The shadows that once wrapped around your identity start slipping off, because there's nothing left for them to attach to. You don't destroy your darkness by pretending it isn't there. You integrate it. You absorb the lessons without keeping the poison. You turn pain into precision. You turn rejection into redirection. You turn isolation into self-reliance. Suddenly, the very things that once weakened you become armor. And that's when the shift becomes undeniable. Your doubt hesitates before speaking. Your fear recalculates before approaching. Your old habits knock before entering. Because they no longer recognize you as easy territory. You're not fragile ground anymore. You're fortified awareness wrapped in experience. You don't flinch at uncomfortable emotions. You don't panic at intrusive thoughts. You don't crumble at the memory of who you used to be. You stand in it, calm, unmoved, almost amused. And the darkness, it starts looking for somewhere else to live.